So NLP in general and syntactic parsing in particular rely very heavily on human annotations. And for both theoretical and practical reasons, we use such annotations as our de facto gold standards, and we use them to train and to evaluate our taggers and parsers. So we put a lot of faith into human annotators, and yet when we look at the psychological literature over the past half a century, you see people like Berzak and Kahneman have been telling us that people are irrational and that they're easily biased, often in very predictable ways. So what do psychologists talk about when they say that people are biased? One of the most famous examples is called anchoring. And anchoring takes place when there is some kind of prior information or prior values that are available to the decision maker. What typically happens is that people align themselves towards these prior values. To give you a concrete example, this is an experiment by Yevgeni and Kahneman, where first they spin a wheel of fortune with numbers ranging from 1 to 100, and then they ask people what is the percentage of African countries in the UN. So they divide the people into two groups. The first is told that the outcome of the wheel of fortune is 10. The second is told that it's 65. And it turns out that the median answer of the first group is 25, while the median answer of the second group is 45. Now what's striking about this experiment is that people align themselves towards these prior values even though they know that they are random and completely irrelevant to the quantity that they need to estimate. And of course, things get only worse if the anchors are actually informed. So fine, people are anchored towards prior information, but how is this relevant to syntactic annotations? Well, it's relevant because syntactic annotation is typically formulated as editing or correction of parser and tagger output. So this is a very practical approach because it saves a lot of annotation time, but we know less on whether it leads to anchoring, and if so, what are the consequences on the resulting annotations and parser evaluations. So these are exactly the questions that we're going to address here. We'll first look at anchoring, and what we'll see is that people are indeed anchored towards the output of the parsers that they're editing, and this leads to inaccurate parser evaluations and lower annotation quality. Anchoring can also affect measurements of inter-annotator agreement, and in order to address that, we'll propose a methodology for measuring agreement that controls for parser bias and reduces annotation errors. Our main result in this context will be that human agreement in our experiment is on par with state-of-the-art parsing for English newswire text. All right, so we have two standard annotation tasks, part of speech tagging with the tree bank tag set, and dependency parsing with universal dependencies. We have two annotation variants, annotation from scratch and reviewing, where as a reviewer you get a pre-annotated sentence that could be annotated either by a human or by a parser, you don't know which, and your task is to indicate all the cases that you would have annotated differently. We have 5 annotators, all of whom are MIT students with pretty extensive linguistic background. They also went through 2 months of training and 5 months of annotating a tree bank, so these are very experienced annotators. Our experimental setup will be out-of-domain annotation, which is a very common scenario in NLP. So we have an existing data set on which we can train parsers. This is the English Web Tree Bank. And now we annotate for a new domain, which will be learner language, so we'll be using sentences from the Cambridge FCE days. We have 300 sentences, and we're going to use all our 5 annotators who will be assigned at random for each sentence to the annotation and reviewing tasks. We're using 2 parsers and 2 taggers, the turbo parser paired with the turbo tagger, and the RBG parser paired with the Stanford tagger. And the reason that we chose these parsers is that they're state-of-the-art, but on the other hand, they use different training algorithms and different features, so in practice they produce different predictions. So to be a little bit more concrete about the experimental setup, for each sentence we have 3 annotations, 1 by a human, and another 2 annotations by 2 different parsers. And now we pass these annotations to 3 additional humans who review these annotations. And so this gives rise to 3 gold standards. One is human gold, which is based on human annotations, turbo gold, which is based on turbo annotations, and RBG gold, which is based on the output of RBG. Now, in order to understand the properties of these annotations, we're going to take our 2 parsers, the turbo parser and the RBG parser, and we're going to evaluate them against each of these gold standards. So when we evaluate the parsers on human gold, we see that the performance is equal. And this is in line with what we know about the performance of these parsers on standard evaluation benchmarks. But now when we evaluate on turbo gold, all of a sudden the turbo parser becomes much, much better than RBG. And conversely, when the evaluation is on RBG gold, RBG becomes much better than true. So each of the parsers is better than the other on its own annotations. And what this tells us is that the annotators are anchored to specific characteristics of the parsers that they're editing. Now, interestingly, this is not the end of the story here. Now we can look at the performance of each parser on the gold standard of the other parser. And we can see that this performance is still higher than their performance on human gold. Now what this tells us is that there are also some shared characteristics in the parser's outputs to which the annotators are anchored as well. So we have this parser-specific bias that means that the parser's comparisons are unfair. And on top of that, we have a parser-shared bias that just gets you overestimation of parsing performance on this kind of gold standards in general. When we combine these two effects, we get a really substantial illusionary error reduction that amounts to 35% on parsing, and we reduce almost half of the error on part-of-speech text. So to summarize, what we've seen so far is that parser editing leads to parser bias. So this means that parser comparisons will be inaccurate and that we get parser-friendly gold standards. Now these are characteristics that we generally want to avoid in our data sets, but the fact that parser-based gold standards are biased towards parsers does not necessarily mean that their quality is worse compared to human-based gold standards. So the natural question to ask here is whether anchoring also leads to reduced quality of annotation. In order to answer this question, we'll extend our setup with a quality evaluation experiment, where now we have an additional human who we call judge, who looks at the disagreements between our three gold standards and ranks them according to their quality. So again, we have our human judge with a binary choice between a human-based gold standard and a parser-based gold standard. And what we see is that on all evaluation metrics, in almost 2/3 of the cases, human judges prefer human-based gold standards over parser-based gold standards. So not only parser-based gold standards are biased towards parsers, they're also worse quality compared to human-based gold standards. And now we're kind of stuck, because we said that parser-based annotations is perhaps relatively fast, but it leads to inaccurate parser evaluations, reduces the annotation quality. But we've been comparing these annotations to human-based annotations, which are very slow, so if you want to annotate at scale, this will be impractical. Fortunately, there is a solution that gives you the best of both worlds. And to see this solution, let's go back to our quality assessment experiment, where we've seen that human judges prefer human-based annotations over parser-based annotations. So now we can split these disagreements into cases where the parsers disagree and cases where the parsers agree. And it turns out that when the parsers disagree, this human tendency to prefer human-based gold standards becomes much more pronounced. However, when the parsers agree, human judges can basically not distinguish between human-based and parser-based gold standards. And this gives rise to the following proposal for how to actually do annotation, where we utilize several parsers. And now we can split the cases to situations where the parsers agree and where they disagree. When the parsers agree, which will be the majority of the cases, we review as before. And when they disagree, we discard the predictions of the parsers and instead annotate from scratch. So this kind of approach will retain the speedups that we have with parser editing, but it will increase the annotation quality by reducing this parser-specific bias that really lies at the heart of this reduced quality of parser-based annotations. So to summarize, we've seen that human annotators exhibit parser bias. This leads to inaccurate parser evaluation. So unfair comparisons between parsers, general overestimation of parsing, and it lowers the annotation quality. We offer the simple solution to edit automatic annotations only when several parsers agree, annotate from scratch otherwise. Now another important topic in syntactic annotation is agreement. We want to know the extent to which humans agree when they perform this task. Now it's not entirely clear what would be the most principled way to measure agreement. What happens in practice is that agreement is measured in the scope of annotation projects that use parser editing. And so agreement is also measured as agreement on parser edits. But we've just seen that people are heavily biased towards the parsers that they're editing, and this entails that our agreement measurements will also be biased. So we can have cases of artificial disagreement when one of the annotators is biased towards the parser, or artificial agreement where both annotators are kind of overly happy to approve the output of the parser. So we want to get the parser out of the heads of the annotators, and the easiest way to do this is just to take the parser completely out of the equation and instead measure agreement on annotation from scratch. So this would be a step forward compared to measuring agreement on parser edits, but there is still a problem that annotation from scratch is a really difficult task. So it has high cognitive load, requires a lot of attention to details, and evidently there will be errors in the annotations. And these errors will of course affect our agreement measurements. So we want to have a way to account for annotation errors, or at least reduce them. And what we propose here is to add additional annotators who review the initial annotations, and then we measure agreement on these reviews. So what's nice about this solution is that it really gives you this reduction in annotation errors, but at the same time it maintains the independence of the annotation sources. So our experimental setup will have 4 annotators. As before, they're assigned randomly for each sentence to annotation and review tasks. We have 300 sentences. Only now the sentences will be a subset of section 23 of the Wall Street Journal and Tree Bank, which, as you all know, is the standard test set for English parsing. Now, interestingly, even though we've been parsing this data set for over 20 years now, there are actually no published results in syntactic agreement with these sentences. So let's look at the results. We start with agreement from scratch on part of speech tags, and we see that this agreement is close to 95%. So to put this number in perspective, this is about 2% more than the agreement from scratch that was reported in the original Penn-Tree Bank paper by Marcus et al. In '93. Agreement from scratch on dependencies is 93%. Now when we add the reviews and we remeasure agreement, it raises by about 1% to 95.7 on part of speech tags and 94.2 on dependencies. Now what's really interesting about these results is to compare them to another baseline, namely the state-of-the-art on part of speech tagging and dependency parsing in NLP. And as you all know, part of speech tagging has been performing over 97% for many years now. And when we look at the latest results from ACL, these are basically on par with our agreement rates for dependency parsing. So there are a few caveats that needs to be mentioned with respect to these results. First of all, dependency parsing is done with Stanford dependencies that are automatically converted from phrase structure trees, whereas we annotate in universal dependencies, so there is a difference in the representation. We also use only a subset of Wall Street Journal 23. And importantly, the human agreement results that we obtain are not necessarily an upper bound on the human agreement that you can get. So you can imagine more training for the annotators, better guidelines, more automatic validation tests. All of these things can in principle raise the agreement. However, even given these caveats, it seems very likely that English newswire parsing is approaching human level agreement. So to summarize, we look at anchoring, and we've seen that human annotators exhibit anchoring towards the parsers that they're editing. This leads to inaccurate parser evaluations and lowers the resulting annotation quality. And we propose a simple and practical solution to address these issues where you use multiple parsers. We also looked at agreement, and we proposed a framework for measuring agreement that controls for parser bias and reduces annotation errors. And the result of our experiment was that human agreement is likely to be on par with state-of-the-art parsing for English newswire text. Okay, so what does this all mean? Perhaps the main question that one could ask here is whether parsing is solved. So the answer to that is no, so there is no need to worry. There are many other data sets, and of course many other languages where parsing performance is still below human agreement. Even when we talk about the Wall Street Journal, it's quite likely that parsers are doing worse errors compared to human disagreement. And this leads us to proposals for future work. So first of all, we need better understanding of human agreement on syntactic annotations. So we need to identify the sources of inconsistent annotation and compare human disagreements to parser errors. We also need to develop new practices for parser evaluation, where the goal is really to ensure that whenever we report improved numbers on parsing, this necessarily corresponds to improved parsing. So in order to support research on these topics, we're releasing our experimental data publicly, so you can download it from this URL and use it in your research. And with that, I'll end my talk.
So, if I understood you right, essentially your proposal is that you run both of the tigers and then you throw away the sentence entirely if there's a disagreement. Have you thought about throwing away only the part of the sentence in which there's a disagreement, you know, some sort of finer grain?
Oh yeah, so it's not...
Do you still have a bias concern there if they agree on the...
Right, so the proposal actually to discard the specific annotations, not the entire sentence.
So basically the one link.
Yeah, so only the bits where they disagree, so you don't need to discard.
Yeah. So I think it's been known for a long time that the programs were performing close to the agreement rate, but it's also been known for a long time the programs aren't doing well. And the problem is that it's just not right to assume that there's one and only one right answer. And when two humans disagree, it's a difference of opinion. And when a computer disagrees with a person, the computer's wrong. Now, this has been understood for 25 years. Now, I think the way forward is not a Rube Goldberg device, not to make the annotations more and more elaborate. The way to go, I think, is the way we do evaluations in TREC and SIG-IR and stuff like that, which is that the programs vote first, and then the judges look at all the candidates, and they evaluate those candidates. And then you can come up with agreements. And then after enough programs have voted enough times, we can use all those judgments to come up with some answers. So in a web query, it's obvious there isn't one and only one right URL. There's a range of URLs that programs will generate, and some of them are better than others, and the judges seem to be able to get through it. So that's a way forward. But what I think we have to do is to abandon this idea that there's one and only one right answer.
I agree with that.
So thanks for a really interesting talk. I wonder about the use of multiple parsers and whether this means that people who are building parsers should be optimizing for diversity in some sense. Because if you have parsers that are too similar, then seeing that they agree is less useful. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we kind of did it on purpose of trying to pick the most different parsers that we come up with back when there are. But in general, yeah, I would say yes, that might be the objective.
Chris Manning, Stanford. This kind of follows on from what Ken said. I mean, so I agree with his point that sometimes there's indeterminacy. I mean, I guess the evaluation method he proposed, I mean, the problem of it is obviously very costly. But I mean, it seems like another possibility of something that you could do in the kind of context of these evaluations that you're doing would be, rather than just sort of measuring agreement, of showing to a second human being the pars produced by one human being or a computer, and asking people whether they think it's wrong. Because, you know, if they don't think it's wrong, well then maybe there's sort of enough indeterminacy that they'll allow in of X or Y, but sometimes they'll clearly think it's wrong, and that would give you a different measure which would allow you to sort of separate out for this sort of the parser bias. You know, the parser bias is partly sort of bad, and it's partly just because the parsers, I think, are consistent, but humans wouldn't necessarily think they're wrong, whereas the humans are inconsistent, but other humans don't think they're wrong.
Right.
So I'd like to thank the honorable gentleman behind me for allowing me. Just one thing. As for the cost, I don't think it's that expensive. We're talking here about, say, 3% of the labels, not 100%. And the number of disagreements among these programs isn't that high, or the number of disagreements among the judges isn't going to be that high. So we only have to call out for adjudication small numbers of cases, so it's not that bad. And I think that that is, if you did a couple of iterations of this, you'd work through most of the disagreements pretty quickly. But it requires some thought how to do it. All right, please. I yield to the man behind me.
So just as a side note, we ran a very preliminary experiment where the annotators were going over all these disagreements in the ranking files and basically saying whether they think there is some sort of ambiguity in the parse, and that's the reason for the disagreement, or whether it's something that can be considered strictly an error. And these are only two people that went over a subset of these sentences, but the estimate was around 40% ambiguity, or something that they would consider, okay, I would have accepted these parts.
So it's a question of, is it a difference of opinion or an error?
Yeah.
And sort of it's a different kind of thing of would I let it slide or would I object?
Right.
So first of all, thanks for carefully collecting all this data and doing this careful work. To Ken's point, I wonder whether it should even be humans that evaluate whether the parses are right, or if you could use downstream tasks. Since you made the point,
Aliens.
whether you could use downstream tasks. Since you made the comment, I think that the parsers might be making worse errors, and I had the notion that by worse error you meant something like a downstream task.
Or
it would fail badly, like
yeah,
interpretation.
Right. I mean, humans can, disagree about the coarse grain and fine grain label for dependency, for example. So a lot of the disagreements make sense, and somehow you can understand the reasoning, like in parsing sometimes you just get. So that was in that context, but yeah. So that even if that humans would evaluate the
No, I mean, you might have a better loss function than doesn't agree with a human.
Yeah.
Does it lead to a catastrophic failure?
Yeah, right. That's good. So essentially what you're doing in the use several parsers solution is confidence estimation. In fact, I think your method is pretty much the same way the educational testing service does confidence estimation in essay grading. They have 2 graders on the essay. If they disagree by more than 1 point, then they bring in a 3rd grader to resolve. In their setup, the first 2 graders are 1 human and 1 computer, or at least that was the case for a while. I don't know what they're doing now. You're suggesting start out with 2 computers and then bring in a human. There's a long history of work in confidence estimation where you try to get some method other than maybe more finer grained than agreement of 2 different systems to figure out whether you've made some mistake. The systems themselves have confidence. You ask the computer, do you think that this is a noun phrase? And it says, yes, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes people train external classifiers. And I wonder if you could use finer grained methods to direct attention to the parses or the portions of parses that might need human attention.
Yeah, that would be super interesting to try. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.